I went in there and come out there.
A pretty lucky miss. Do you think they meant to kill you?
You think they meant to kill me? Well, I'll show you the clothes I shot in. See what you think you saw. No one's ever seen these. Probably Bob Bottom like to get these.
For young George, crime was a means of escape from the poverty he was born into. He stole cars, fenced stolen goods, and hustled in pool halls for money. When his mother found him a job as a stable boy with a horse trainer, it began a lifetime connection with the racing industry. But it wasn't long before George returned to his old ways and found himself back before the courts. This time, he was sent to the infamous Gosford Boys' Home.
It's a very brutal environment. Back in those days, it was seen as quite okay for the older boys to harm these younger kids in all sorts of ways.
Inside the boys' home, George befriended another vicious kid called Stanley John Smith. The two became lifelong friends and partners in crime.
George's early career gave no indication really of what he would become because, frankly, as a criminal, he was inept. He had a string of firearm offences against him. He couldn't burgle a house without being caught. Everything he tried as a criminal was a disaster.
George spent much of his 20s in jail. During a stretch in Long Bay Jail for safe-breaking, he fell in with another Gosford Boys' Home graduate, Lenny McPherson.
Lenny McPherson told George that he wasn't the very best of criminals. He was always getting caught and he should take on SP bookmaking. And as it turned out, it was extremely good advice.
Until 1931, punters could only place a bet on a horse race if they were physically at the racetrack and only with a registered bookie. That inconvenience led to the rise of SP, or starting price bookmakers. When Freeman came out of jail, he joined forces with Lenny McPherson and Stan Smith. This trio became known as the Team and governed the East Coast criminal milieu.
The Sydney push, as wild and vicious as it was, it loved order. It needed the connections between corrupt police, politicians, and the villains and so forth. It needed a certain amount of order because otherwise there was chaos. So you couldn't afford to have people running around like loose cannons.
One such loose cannon was a violent psychopath called Stuart John Regan. He threatened the interests of the Team by exposing corrupt police, some of whom provided the protection the Team relied upon.
And funnily enough, he was shot in the laneway outside an illegal gambling place. And out at that gambling place that night, of all people, Lenny McPherson, George Freeman and Stan Smith all happened to have been there that night. But no one could ever be pinned for it.
George seldom got his hands dirty, but when his interests were at stake, he didn't hesitate to do what was necessary. Freeman ran the biggest illegal gambling operation, partly because he ran a good game, but also because he could shut down unauthorised rivals with a call to his police minders. Jeff Schuberg monitored Freeman's activities during the Team's reign.
And if any individual wanted to set up a two-up game, and I'm talking about a major two-up game, not something in the back lane of a pub on the spur of the moment, but from established premises, or an illegal game, they needed George's approval, and they just didn't do it unless they got it. If they set it up without him, he'd close them down.
His thriving SP bookmaking business was integrated with another sideline, race fixing.
Under Freeman's time, the network of SPs became substantial. All of a sudden, it wasn't just a sort of friendly Fred at the pub. There were this group that all operated under Freeman's control.
Corrupt police, judges and politicians provided a force field of protection. It didn't come for free. Freeman and McPherson had learnt in boys' homes that informers prospered, and Lenny, aka Mr Big, was a serial police informer. Lenny's lagging on friends and enemies provided cover for Freeman too, even if he wasn't providing information. Jeff Schuberg was one of the few police prepared to break ranks and bring Freeman and the Team to justice.
Over a period of 10 to 15 years, I monitored Freeman's activities. Between Smith, Freeman and McPherson, they also collected money from casinos, and George collected that money personally. And I can remember times when I'd follow him from his home and he'd drive along General Holmes Drive past the airport, sitting on sometimes 90 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour. And I used to say to my colleagues, we'd be better off locking George up for driving in a speed dangerous to the public than trying to get a brief on him with anything else, because George at that stage was protected. He was protected by crooked cops. And if we ever got anything on him, then someone was helping him out and they were feeding information to him about our activities.
So journalist Bob Bottom set out to expose the depth of corruption in New South Wales and the profitable relationship between the state and criminals like George Freeman. But messing with Freeman carried a health warning.
My disclosures and some of the work I did behind the scenes made it difficult for him to deal with people. He was trying to mix with politicians and people like that, and because once he came subject to the attention he did in 78, 79, a lot of those people were starting to cut him off, and he was very annoyed about that. He blamed me for that. He actually sent someone to throw petrol over our pet cat and set it alight, and couldn't help but get someone to ring up the next day and just to let him know that he did it, but how do you prove it,
Drugs were steadily taking over in Sydney, and with this new business came people who would not obey the old rules. Thugs and hitmen like Christopher Rentakill Flannery, who threatened the status quo that had made George rich and untouchable.
McPherson and Freeman took Flannery under their wing, primarily as a means of trying to keep some control of him. They were aware of his reputation. They didn't want the problems he could cause in Sydney. And they figured by giving him some form of employment, they might be able to control him.
Flannery, like Regan, was an uncontrollable individual. He came up from Melbourne and he wanted to make a mark on the Sydney scene. I don't think he really cared what he got involved in or who he got involved with. If you had him in your camp, you couldn't trust him to sort of stay with you because he'd be just as likely to go to the opposition.
Flannery had a well-deserved reputation when he hit Sydney. A cold-blooded killer offering to kill anyone for $50,000. But when he shot a police officer, he crossed a line. Just like Stuart John Regan a decade earlier, Freeman and the team decided that Flannery had to go.
Flannery's family raised the alarm last night when the 36-year-old ex-Melbourne crime figure failed to return from a business appointment. His wife told police that appointment was with racing identity George Freeman. This morning, Freeman's fortress-like Yowie Bay mansion was first on the list for detectives from the Gang War Task Force. They searched the grounds and spent an hour talking to Freeman, his family and lawyer. Task Force Chief Inspector John Anderson emerging satisfied that Flannery kept no appointment yesterday at the residence.
Yes. Well, it's highly probable that he has been killed, judging on the spate of killings we've had since last November, but we can't confirm at this stage one way or the other.
There's little doubt that George Freeman was instrumental in Flannery's death. But whether he pulled the trigger remains a mystery.
George Freeman was a very cunning man, and Flannery was still employed as his minder stroke standover man. And what we were told is that Flannery and George Freeman used to regularly take a sauna together. And on one of these occasions when they were having a sauna together, Freeman casually mentioned to Flannery that he had access to a high-powered machine pistol. And in fact said to Flannery, "Are you interested in?" Of course, he registered a positive response. Ultimately, Flannery went to Freeman's home and Freeman went and retrieved the machine pistol. So Flannery fully expected a gun to be presented to him in his presence, but what he did not expect was to be shot with the same firearm.
With Flannery gone, the threat was eliminated. But Freeman was dealing with another more personal demon. He was hooked on prescription drugs. His secret habit began in 1979 after Jackie Muller shot him in the face. He was the stepfather of a woman Freeman was having an affair with.
I went in there and come out there.
A pretty lucky miss. Do you think they meant to kill him?
You think they meant to kill me? Well, I'll show you the clothes I shot in. See what you think you saw. No one's ever seen these. Probably top bottom like to get these.
He was prescribed pethidine, a highly addictive painkiller. The problem for George was that he was heavily asthmatic, which made pethidine a very dangerous drug.
When you look at the side effects of pethidine, one of the major side effects of regular use is it tends to dampen down the respiratory system. You start feeling as if you're not getting enough air. Pethidine had more of an effect on his respiration than the asthma did.
Freeman suffered an asthma attack at his townhouse in Sydney South this morning. It brought on a fatal heart attack.
St Stephen's Uniting Church in the city was packed for George Freeman's funeral. There was his best mate, Lenny the big fella McPherson.
I think the greatest gift from God was George Freeman to me.
When Freeman died in 1990, he was under investigation by the National Crime Authority for bribery, corruption, illegal gambling, tax evasion and murder. But George managed to avoid it all. He hadn't been in a jail cell since 1968. Never again would any crim run Sydney the way that George Freeman and his mates had.